Hello, Geasas. Welcome to another episode of ADHD History. I'm your host, Xander Millette, here to tell you the history of the world in no particular order. Today, I'm going to take you back to ancient times and talk about Greece, specifically Athens and Sparta. These two city-states, or polis as they used to be called, were very similar, but at the same time as different as vanilla and chocolate. Quick disclaimer, I don't speak Greek, though I'm working on finding some classes, so there's a 99.999% chance I'm going to butcher a lot of words in this episode, and I beg the indulgence of anyone who actually speaks the language. Without further ado, let's jump on in. Some overview of ancient Greece real quick, just in case you've been living under a rock and know nothing about Greece. Like some people in my life I won't name, but they know who they are and should be ashamed.
You make me sad.
During the Bronze Age, which was roughly 3000 to 1000 BCE, is when Greece established itself as a hub of trade for wine, olive oil, pottery, and textiles. They also found themselves in demand for their fine craftsmanship of luxury items made of marble, obsidian, bronze, silver, and gold. Greece, during this time period, was home to both the Minoan and the Mycenaean civilizations. It's estimated that the Ionians came to Greece around 2000 BCE, and the Dorians followed about 800 years later in 1200 BCE. The Dorians were responsible for doing away with the last of the Minoan and Mycenaean empires. Athens and Sparta were both critical to the development of ancient Greek culture, but they differed in many ways. While both considered themselves Hellenes, or Greeks as the Romans called them, Athenians were Ionian, Spartans were Dorian, and they spoke distinctly different dialects of the Greek language. There was also a third group, the Aeolians, that spoke yet another dialect, but we're just focused on the first two. Athens and Sparta were also vastly different in how their city-states were developed and the day-to-day lives of their citizens. The first difference people think of between the two is not their ancestral background or their language. It's how they differed in their approach to war. But we'll get to that. Let's start with Sparta. Known in ancient times as Lacedaemonians, the people now called Spartans focused primarily on their citizens' discipline, obedience, and willingness to fight for Sparta. That was their greatest strength, a sense of unity through combat and the unwillingness to ever back down from a battle. The Spartans were considered Dorian Hellenes, as they were thought to be descendants of those who migrated and settled in the Laconia area. Sparta also claims fame as the polis Helen was stolen from and taken to Troy, leading to the event of the Trojan War as written by Homer. Lycurgus was said to be a ruler of Sparta in the 9th century BCE and credited with the reformation of Spartan laws. For instance, the older soldiers were given permission under Lycurgus's law to be whip-bearers, responsible for the punishment of younger boys should they not obey. This was so the younger soldiers would dread the disgrace of a whipping and be even more willing to obey orders from superiors. Lycurgus himself is a probable invention. Herodotus claims in his histories that Lycurgus was believed to be a god by the oracle at Delphi. Plutarch confessed in the prologue of his Lycurgus biography that everything one source would write of Lycurgus was contradicted by another author, leaving Plutarch with no clearer picture of the man. Plutarch also wrote that once his laws were adopted and seemed to be working, Lycurgus left Sparta and starved himself to death.
Do you think that was wise?
But whether he was or wasn't real, Spartans took his laws very, very seriously for centuries to come. At the age of 7, boys were removed from their homes and enrolled in school, or agoge. They were required to learn all manner of sports, including, but not limited to, swimming, wrestling, and boxing. At 18, they were sent out and required to steal food to survive, so that they could learn stealth and cunning. If they were caught, the punishment was to be flogged, something usually reserved for slaves, and that would increase their shame and encourage them to never be caught again. At 20, they would undergo a series of tests to prove their fitness and leadership capabilities, as well as applying for election to a CCTI. Basically, a company of about 15 men who lived, ate, and fought together. Those that passed the trials were enlisted in the military and lived in the barracks with the other soldiers. At 30, they would be granted full citizenship in Sparta, but only if they were a member of a syssitia. Not as easy a feat as it seems, as one vote against their joining was enough to bar them from membership. And then at 60, they would be allowed to retire. Same-sex relationships among men and women were also allowed and regarded as natural, so long as the people involved were of age and had consented. Modern notions of homosexuality were unknown to them at the time. Instead, they practiced what we now call pederasty.
Yes, that of course I do already know about homosexuality.
Pederasty between older and younger men was encouraged, with the older man serving as a guide, or esates, and the younger eromenos. The younger man's conduct reflected on the older. If the younger was hurt in a fight and cried out, the older would be fined for his lover's cowardice. It's important to note that while I say lover, these relationships weren't always sexual, though it's impossible to know how often they actually were. It was more of a ceremonial bond, designed to mentor young men into becoming model citizens of their city-states by following the example of the older. Relationships between men were not encouraged in Athens, but they were accepted, particularly among the upper classes, such as the relationship between Socrates and Alcibiades. But more on that in another time. Women in Sparta were also expected to be physically fit like the men, though not to the same standard. They participated in sports such as running and wrestling until marriage, though there is evidence of some married and even pregnant women exercising. According to Lycurgus, quote, "The female should practice bodily exercise no less than the male sex. They must feel stronger desire for the company of one another and produce more robust offspring," end quote. He also stated that, quote, "An old man should introduce to his wife whatever man in the prime of life he admired for his bodily and mental capabilities, so that she might have children by him," end quote. They believed that women with the best physical prowess would provide the greatest offspring for Spartans to continue replenishing their army. Spartan women were also allowed much more independence than other women of the age, being allowed to own property and participate in politics. Women in Sparta without any legitimate brothers would inherit their father's property in their own right. They were called patrochoi. Sorry about the mispronunciation. It literally means holders of the patrimony. There were also no adultery laws in Sparta, and men would lend their wives to other men for procreation purposes, and any children produced would go to that other man's lineage.
Cute, thanks.
Apparently, women usually jumped at this chance, as it would give them the opportunity to manage more than one household. Not that they did any of the work, really. The subjugated class called helots took care of menial labor, including the weaving of clothes, allowing a female Spartan to concentrate on what Lycurgus believed their most important role: motherhood. He specified, quote, "Female slaves were competent to furnish clothes, and the production of children was the noblest duty of the free," end quote. Helots were basically tasked with everything considered beneath the mighty Spartans. When a man became a full member of the military, he was given land that would be farmed exclusively by helots, and those farmers were responsible for providing their master's contribution to their syssitia. This was so the man could be free from providing his own living and able to spend his entire life as a soldier.
You gotta do what you gotta do.
Men were rarely at home, since they were required to live in the barracks with the rest of the army, and probably increased the independence Spartan women enjoyed. Women were also allowed to take lovers that were not their husbands in order to continue having children, even without their permission. Through these liaisons, women could acquire more than one home, as I said, and many women became wealthy landowners this way. Marriage was also handled in an odd way. The bride would be made to shave her head and lie on a rush mattress and wait alone in the dark. The groom would eat with his comrades and then slip away as unobtrusively as possible. They would have relations, and then the groom would sneak back into his barracks like he'd never even been gone. He would continue doing this until his wife fell pregnant. Plutarch stated, quote, "And they did carry on like this for a short time only, but long enough for them to become fathers before they had even seen their own wives in the light of day," end quote.
That poor lady.
For the Spartans, war was their primary reason for existence, and everything in their culture was centered around it. So much so that Lycurgus prohibited free citizens from anything to do with business, viewing wealth as a distraction. He made all citizenship privileges available to everyone without discrimination for weakness of the body or limited financial means, so long as they did as commanded by Spartan law. But if they should be too lazy to do what the laws demanded, they would no longer be considered a citizen. Education outside of military topics was virtually non-existent. Their constitution was complicated, first and foremost because they had two kings. One or the other of them would be chosen to command the army in times of war, to avoid arguments that may lead to defeat. Aristotle, in his writing titled Politics, dismissed the Spartan kings as mere hereditary generals, feeling that since they were powerless while at home, they were the lapdogs of the ephors. In times of peace, their powers were limited. Sparta had a council of elders, the Gerousia, which resembled the Athenian council of Areopagus. The Spartan kings were members of the council, along with 28 men over the age of 60 chosen by the citizens for life. There was also the assembly, which differed from its Athenian counterpart by having only members over the age of 30. In the assembly, votes were counted by the loudest acclamation, as the raising of hands was considered a sign of surrender, and cowardice, of course, was never to be shown. In addition to the kings, the Gerousia, and the assembly, there was a unique branch of government peculiar to Sparta, the 5 ephors. They were elected as sort of an ethical balance to the kings. When one of the kings would go to war, 2 ephors would go with him to watch his behavior. The ephors were also in charge of, in modern-day terms, a secret police force. Called the Cryptia, the force was made up of young Spartans equipped only with basic rations and daggers. Only those willing to serve in the Cryptia would be likely to receive senior public posts later on in their lives. When dispatched, they were required to stay hidden during the daytime, and once night fell, they were charged with slaying every helot they'd crossed paths with. The reasons behind their militantism have a clear answer. Sparta had begun as a city-state of farmers, and when they required more space, they invaded a neighboring territory of Messenia and enslaved the people. The Messenians rose in revolt roughly 650 BCE, and it took nearly 30 years for the Spartans to regain control.
Help! Help! I'm being repressed!
This changed Sparta from then on, and their army became not only universally feared, but respected as well. They enslaved the Messenians as helots and redeclared war on them once a year, so that killing them would be legal. At one point in the 5th century, helots were told to give the names of those helots they felt deserved to be given their freedom. 2,000 helots were crowned with wreaths and led on procession to the sacred places of the gods, and then vanished forever.
It's a trap!
The subjugation of Messenia made Sparta the most powerful of the Greek city-states. The upside was that they had all the helots they needed to keep their polis running. The downside was the army could never stay away too long from their borders because of the risk of revolts, so they were never really able to gain much influence anywhere else. The Spartans were known as a powerful land force, while Athens was known for its navy. Sparta would eventually create its own navy, leading to the defeat of Athens during the Peloponnesian War. And I'll get to that later. Spartans were also known to be much more religiously observant than the rest of Greece, taking their piety and devotion to exceptional heights. Herodotus mentions twice in his histories that Spartans honored the things of the gods more highly than the things of men. The Spartans didn't show up for the Battle of Marathon because the moon was inauspicious, and they didn't send a full force to Thermopylae because they were celebrating the Carnea festival. They would sacrifice animals before crossing rivers and right before engaging in battle. If the signs weren't right, they would delay until the signs were good, or just cancel a battle altogether. Athens, while possessing a formidable military itself, was much less focused on war than Sparta. Their strength was their focus on culture, philosophy, and education. Pericles, an Athenian leader of the Peloponnesian War, stated in his famous funeral oration, quote, "At Athens we live exactly as we please, and yet are just as ready to encounter every legitimate danger." End quote. Athenians took their ideas on how to run their military from the patron goddess of their city, Athena. Military force was invaluable, but it should be paired with wisdom and ingenuity. It goes almost without saying that Athenian men had many more options for occupation than Spartan men. Keep in mind that the economic prosperity of Athens was built on the labor of slaves and metics, or foreign residents. This allowed Athenian citizens, particularly the wealthier ones, to have way more leisure and pursue a wider range of occupation. The level of political engagement in Athens allowed men there to pursue careers in politics and public service, whether as politicians, diplomats, or government officials. They had opportunities to engage in trade, shipbuilding, and commerce, and the city's marketplaces and workshops offered a variety of jobs such as craftsmen and merchants to bankers and traders. Athens was home to famous philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, as well as playwrights like Sophocles and Aeschylus. Wow, I can't pronounce his name. Men in Athens had access to educational institutions like the Academy and the Lyceum, where they could pursue philosophy, mathematics, rhetorics, and other intellectual pursuits. Men could become artists, sculptors, architects, or musicians. While both Athens and Sparta had military obligations, Athens did not place as heavy an emphasis on military training and service as Sparta did. Athenian citizens were required to serve in the military during times of conflict, but they had more flexibility in pursuing other careers and interests during peacetime. The roles and status of Athenian women varied depending on factors such as social class and individual circumstances. Women from wealthier families had more opportunities and freedoms than those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, which honestly isn't saying much.
Ah, nuts.
Enslaved women in Athens had even fewer rights than free women. Non-citizen women, including foreign residents and slaves, had limited legal protections and were often vulnerable to exploitation. Athenian women were generally not allowed in public, relegated to their houses and household tasks. Pericles once stated, "Great will be your glory in not falling short of your natural character, and greatest will be hers who is least talked of among the men, whether for good or for bad."
You're a loony.
Aristotle in his Politics was apparently horrified by Spartan women being allowed as much freedom as they were, and believed that he could scientifically prove that women's bodies and minds were inferior to males. This includes the idea that women were just deformed males, and that they lacked the capacity for reason and logic. Hell of a feminist, that Aristotle. Idiot. Anyway, while women in Sparta could inherit outright, Athenian women would inherit property only until they had a male heir to pass it on to. Athenian women had virtually no political rights or civic participation. They were not allowed to vote in the Democratic Assembly, hold public office, or participate in political discussions. Citizenship, which granted these rights, was typically passed down from father to son, with women being left right the heck out. Women lived in a separate part of the house called the gyneceum, and they were expected to remain indoors and out of the public eye. They typically wore modest clothing that covered their entire body, and often veiled their faces when in public. This seclusion was partly due to the belief that it protected women's modesty and prevented them from interacting with unrelated men. The primary role for Athenian women was that of a wife and mother. Marriage was considered the most important event in a woman's life, and it was typically arranged by her male relatives, without her ever even meeting her groom. The main purpose of marriage was procreation and the continuation of the family line, and that was all that mattered. There was a small group of women known as the hetaerae, who were highly educated, often accomplished in the arts, and could engage in intellectual discussions. However, they were considered social companions and entertainers for men, rather than equals. One of the defining features of the hetaerae was their independence. Unlike Athenian wives who were expected to fulfill domestic roles and raise the kids, hetaerae had the freedom to pursue their own interests and careers. They were not bound by the same social constraints and responsibilities as wives. They were invited to social gatherings, banquets, and symposia, where they added an element of cultural refinement.
This will be a night to remember.
Hetaerae were financially independent, often supported by their patrons or admirers. These patrons would provide them with gifts, financial support, and sometimes even accommodations. They were not bound by the traditional bonds of marriage or family life. They were free to have multiple relationships and could choose their partners. Some had long-term relationships, while others had more transient arrangements. Hetaerae were admired and celebrated by some members of Athenian society. However, they were also criticized by more conservative elements for challenging traditional gender roles. While they enjoyed certain privileges and freedoms, they were still part of a society deeply rooted in patriarchy, where men held the majority of political and social power. Athens was the birthplace of demokratia, a system where kratos, the power to rule, came from demos, the people. The beginnings of this came from a man named Solon, who was elected as eponymous archon of Athens in 594 or 593 BCE. He started his year-long rule by declaring all debts were to be forgiven, and those who were enslaved for not paying their debts be made free men once more. He also made the election of future archons dependent on fate and the gods rather than nepotism and corruption. Each of the 4 tribes, and I am just going to butcher the names of these tribes, and I'm sorry. The Pentakosioe Demini, the richest class, with an income of 500 bushels of grain or more. The Hippias, whose income was estimated between 500 and 300 bushels. The Zegutii, who produced roughly 200 bushels. And the Thetius, the serfs whose manual labor brought in less than 150 bushels. These 4 tribes would submit the names of 10 men, equaling 40 names in total, and the next 9 archons would be drawn by lot. Pisistratus was Solon's Eromenos, the younger in the Greek system of pederasty to Solon's Erastus, and he continued the changes to Athens' governing. However, he chose to enact the changes as a tyrant. He had taken control twice before and was driven out of Athens both times before managing to keep power the 3rd attempt. You gotta give the guy credit for sticking to his goals.
I'm invincible!
He exiled many of the former aristocracy and left Solon's constitution and institutions in place. Archons took office every year as usual, though the name of a family member or reliable ally regularly appeared on that list. He also started exploration of the mineral resources of Athens, creating many mines that brought in a huge income. Pisistratus is also responsible for how the Agora of Athens was laid out. He chose a roughly triangular area near the main road into the city, demolishing houses, clearing an old burial ground, and closing wells for the space. A fountain house was built, and it was opened up to the public and gave access to basins and running water spouts, leading to the fountain house being named the 9 Spouts. Very imaginative.
But that's how it works! Leave me alone!
In the southwest corner, archaeologists have found evidence of a large building that is theorized to have been Pisistratus' residence. He's said to have died at the age of 75, which is just impressive as heck for that time period. It was a group of exiled men that ended the tyranny rule of Athens. They were called the Alcmenoids, and they attempted several assassinations of Pisistratus' successors before they finally succeeded. Two of the failed assassins, Harmodius and Arisogeiton, who had been killed for their plot, were advanced to the rank of national heroes. Their descendants were given perpetual freedom from taxes, the right to eat at the public's expense at the town hall, exemption from some religious duties, and permanent front row seats at the theater. The man who led the Alcmenoids was called Cleisthenes, and he recognized that the general public would not accept just going back under the yoke of the aristocracy, or a top-down system of any kind. So, he invented democracy. He devised a set of complicated and artificial constitutional arrangements that shouldn't have worked, but the Athenians accepted them and put them into effect. By modern standards, Athens had a very small population, so it was possible to assemble a majority of male citizens in one place to debate and improve legislation. In the agora stood a monument with a marble base and 10 life-size statues. The statues depicted 10 legendary heroes of Athens, such as Theseus and Heracles. Their collective title was the Eponymous Heroes, because they gave their names to the 10 new tribes into which Cleisthenes divided the citizenry, replacing the 4 old tribes. His reasoning for inventing new tribes was to eliminate, or at the very least weaken, the main political factions, causing instability in the polis. Each of the 10 tribes was made to draw its membership from 3 different regions: the coast, the interior, and the city itself. Members of the same tribe could come from different parts of the country, meaning old local and territorial loyalties were dissolved. Cleisthenes divided the territory of Attica into 139 demes, or villages. Each deme was allocated to one of the 3 regions, and so to a tribe. Each deme had a mini version of the main government, having its own assembly to pass decrees about local affairs, and they elected their own officials. Back in Athens, Cleisthenes got rid of Solon's old council based on the 4 tribes, and replaced it with a council of 500. Each of the 10 tribes gave 50 members chosen annually, of which nobody could serve more than twice in their lives, or more than once in a decade. This committee was too large to be effective, so the year was divided into 10 parts. The 50 counselors from each tribe acted as an executive subcommittee for 1/10 of the year, or 36 days. At least 17 members had to be on hand at all times to deal with urgent business, and they would choose their chairman for each day by lot. Solon, Pisistratus, and Cleisthenes, in my opinion, can be credited for the Athens we think of when we think of ancient Greece. Solon for his original formation of a council, Pisistratus for his attempt to abolish the aristocracy, and Cleisthenes for his efficient creation of the first democratic government. The Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE is one of the most famous battles of ancient Greece and is still well known to this day. Reportedly, there were around 6,000 Persian casualties in comparison to just 192 dead Athenians. The Athenian hoplites who won the battle were given a new honorific title, the Marathon Fighters, and even hundreds of years later were still regularly sung about in hymns in official Athenian ceremonies honoring those killed in the battle. The defeated Persian king, Darius, died in 486 and was succeeded by his son Xerxes. Xerxes decided that he would finish what his father started and conquer Greece for Persia. Herodotus writes that Xerxes should have listened to the advice of his uncle and not made the attempt. But Xerxes probably thought that a nation of divided city-states was weak and scattered politically. He most likely thought that the Greek way of hoplite fighting wouldn't serve them very well against numberless hordes of Persians. How many was numberless? Herodotus did some math that gave us roughly 5,283,220 people. There were not that many people. Theory goes that Herodotus screwed up the Persian words for 1,000 and 10,000. If the math is redone with that in mind, it gives us about 210,000. A much more reasonable, though still huge, number. Xerxes seemed to have overlooked the fact that Athenians had just built a fleet of first-class trireme warships. He also seemed to have forgotten that one of the Spartan kings had been exiled and taken in by the Persians. This exiled king sent a secret letter to Sparta, warning them of impending attack. In 481, a few Greek cities and peoples swore binding religious oaths to jointly resist the Persians under the leadership of the Spartans. The trust in the Spartans as war leaders was so absolute that they were even given command of the navy, despite the Spartans having no experience with naval warfare. This was the beginning of the Persian War. The Persian War is where the Battle of Thermopylae took place, made famous by the movie 300.
This is Sparta!
The Spartans did indeed only send 300 warriors to this battle under the general Leonidas, chosen because they all had living sons so their bloodlines wouldn't die out. Apparently, it was 300 minus 2. Those 2 were prevented from fighting because of some serious eye affliction. The stories of what happened to them vary. One source says one killed himself from shame after returning to Sparta, and the other redeemed himself by dying in battle the next year. Another source says that one said, "Screw it," ordered his slave to lead him to the battlefield because he couldn't see, and was almost immediately killed in the fray, while the other went back to Sparta and was ostracized and nicknamed the Trembler for his cowardice. Anyway, there were give or take 300 Spartans at the battle, as well as about 7,000 other soldiers from various Greek peoples. The Spartans viewed the defense of the hot gates at Thermopylae as a suicide mission, and were perfectly fine with that, while the rest of the Greek forces viewed it as a brave resistance that would enact an honorable retreat to fight another day. Xerxes sent a letter to them calling on them to hand over their weapons. The Spartans wrote back, "Come and get them."
Any more ridiculous ideas?
The first 2 days of the battle were a series of feigned retreats by the Greek forces, followed by sudden turnarounds and then a merciless slaughter of their overconfident Persian pursuers. But on day 3, a Greek traitor led the Persian forces on a hidden path that let them attack the Greeks from behind in a surprise attack. When told that there were so many archers on the Persian side that their arrows would black out the sun, the Spartan Dionysius uttered the famous words,
"Then we will fight in the shade."
And during their morning meal before they engaged the enemy, Leonidas said his equally famous words,
Ready your breakfast and eat hearty. But tonight, we dine in hell!
Leonidas apparently fought and died like a man possessed on that final day, and, spurred on by his deaths, the Greeks tallied up more Persian deaths than in the 2 days before. The battle was ultimately a loss for the Greek side. They erected a stone lion monument for Leonidas that still survives to this day, though a little worse for wear. Later on during the war, the Persians swept into Athens, which had been abandoned in advance. But descendants of Pisistratus, the tyrant who had died like 100 years before, met the Persians on the Acropolis and offered peaceful surrender of Athens in exchange for returning their family to tyrannical rule.
Now that is just not appropriate.
Apparently, they just passed a grudge on down through the generations, which is hilarious to me. The Persians said no, though, and they killed everyone there. Xerxes set fire to all of the temples on the Acropolis and considered himself having won the war. This was not the case. During a naval battle, the Persians lost 200 ships to the Greeks' 40, and apparently this pretty much knocked the spirit out of Xerxes' army. Later, a rumor was spread through the Persian camp that the Greek fleet had been defeated. Believing it, the Persians came out of their camp to fight what they thought would be an easy cleanup battle. Instead, they were slaughtered by the Greeks, who then burned their camp and the rest of the warships. Xerxes no longer had a navy, and when he heard the news, he apparently went into a state of shock. In the end, the Persian War was won by the Greeks. For Athens, it was proof that democracy worked. Athens set up the Delian League, an anti-Persian naval alliance, named such because the treasury of the league was kept on the sacred island of Delos. Xerxes lost control of the Aegean Sea, and Athens became the new sea power. A Persian army would never again invade the Greek mainland. The Peloponnesian War was from about 431 to 404 BCE. One of the key events that set off this war was an earthquake in 464. It's said that the death toll in Greece was about 20,000, but modern historians think it may have been exaggerated. Nonetheless, many Spartans were lost in the quake, and the Helots took the opportunity to revolt. Other Greek cities were called on to assist Sparta, including Athens. But when the Athens contingent arrived, the Spartans sent them home and let the soldiers from the other cities stay. The Athenians were insulted and dismantled their alliance with Sparta. The Athenian leader of the Peloponnesian War at first was a man named Pericles. Pericles was by far the most influential political figure of the city, as well as being a capable and aggressive military commander. He introduced a citizenship law, making it so that both of a person's parents had to be Athenians in order to qualify for citizenship themselves. He also changed it so that public officials were no longer elected, but chosen by lot, and made it so those positions were paid. Otherwise, the working poor who were chosen wouldn't be able to find time to fulfill their duties. Pericles also started paying people who got chosen to sit on the juries. The war was primarily driven by power struggles and differing ideologies between Athens and Sparta, but issues such as disputes over resources, trade routes, and alliances fueled tensions. The Archidamian War was the first phase of the Peloponnesian War, and was named after Archidamus II, a Spartan king who advocated a cautious, defensive strategy. At the outset of the war, both Athens and Sparta had specific objectives. Athens sought to maintain and expand its maritime empire, while Sparta aimed to challenge Athenian dominance in the Greek world. Archidamus II's strategy, known as the Archidamian strategy, so imaginative, was based on avoiding direct pitched battles with the Athenians. Instead, he advocated for protracted war of attrition, believing that time was on Sparta's side. The Spartans fortified their territory, particularly the Peloponnesian Peninsula, to withstand prolonged sieges. In contrast, Athens, under the leadership of Pericles, adopted a strategy that relied on its powerful navy and the safety of its city walls. Pericles believed that as long as Athens controlled the sea and could import supplies from its empire, it could withstand a long conflict. The Athenians withdrew behind the walls of Athens and depended on the city's great port, the Piraeus, for resources. But during the early years of the war, a devastating plague struck Athens, causing significant loss of life, including Pericles. This epidemic weakened Athens both militarily and politically, but it didn't end the conflict. In 421 BCE, both sides agreed to a temporary truce known as the Peace of Nicias, named after the Athenian general Nicias. This peace was supposed to last for 50 years, but it was marred by sporadic skirmishes and violations. Despite the peace, the years following the Peace of Nicias saw growing internal challenges within both Athens and Sparta. Athenian democratic politics became increasingly fractionalized, leading to political upheaval, while Sparta faced pressure from its allies, particularly Corinth, to continue the war.
Again? Seriously?
The Declian War is considered the second phase of the Peloponnesian War. One of the most significant developments during this phase was Sparta's successful alliance with the Persian Empire, specifically the satraps Tissaphernes and Pharnabazus. Sparta negotiated financial and naval support from Persia, which allowed them to build a formidable navy of their own. During the Declian War, Athens faced several major setbacks. The most notable was the disastrous Sicilian expedition, where an Athenian fleet and army were sent to conquer the city of Syracuse in Sicily. The campaign ended in failure and significant losses for Athens, both in terms of troops and ships. Whereas the financial support from Persia enabled Sparta to fortify the city of Decelea in the Athenian territory of Attica. This had a devastating impact on Athens as it disrupted their agriculture and trade routes, causing economic strain. Athens also faced revolts from some of its allies within the Delian League, which further weakened its position. Cities like Chios, Miletus, and Rhodes turned against Athens and joined the Spartan alliance. By the late 410s BCE, Athens was in a dire situation. Its treasury was depleted, its fleet was weakened, and its empire was shrinking. The Declian War finally came to an end in 404 BCE when Athens, besieged by both the Spartan-Persian fleet and its own internal issues, surrendered to Sparta. The terms of surrender were harsh, and Athens was forced to dismantle its long walls, which connected Athens to the port of Piraeus, and surrender its empire. The Peloponnesian War left both Athens and Sparta significantly weakened. The conflict had drained the resources, manpower, and economies of both city-states. Many other Greek polis also suffered during the war, both as combatants and as subjects of the warring powers. It's estimated that tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians perished due to the conflict, including those who succumbed to the plague in Athens. Siege warfare, naval battles, and the deliberate destruction of fortifications took a heavy toll on cities and countryside alike. The war also had profound political consequences. In Athens, the war contributed to turmoil, including the overthrow of the democratic government for a brief period. Athens' defeat marked the end of the Athenian Empire. The Delian League was dissolved, and many of Athens' former allies turned to Sparta for protection. Whereas in Sparta, the war elevated its status as the dominant Greek city-state. But the economies of both Athens and Sparta were severely impacted. Athens suffered from economic decline due to the disruption of trade routes and the loss of its empire's tributes. Sparta also faced economic challenges, but the Persian support it received during the Declian War helped mitigate these issues. The Peloponnesian War contributed to the overall decline of Greek power and influence in the ancient world. The city-states, having exhausted themselves in the conflict, became vulnerable to external threats. This paved the way for the rise of Philip II of Macedon and his son, Alexander the Great, who would later conquer the Greek polis and establish a Hellenistic empire. By 371, there were not many more than 1,000 adult male Spartans. Various causes for this were losses in battle, the earthquake of 464, etc. A large number of those remaining fought and lost at the Battle of Leuctra. About 400 of the 700 sent to fight didn't come back. The effect on Spartan morale was so bad that the surviving king, Agesilaus, decreed that the usual punishments for those accused of cowardice at the battle would not be enacted. Sparta would eventually be conquered by the Romans around Augustus's time and assimilated into the empire. In 396 CE, Sparta was sacked by Visigoths under Alaric I, who then sold inhabitants into slavery. In the Middle Ages, the political and cultural center of Laconia shifted to the nearby settlement of Mistras, and Sparta slipped even further in importance, even by local standards. Today, the Saconian language, still spoken in Saconia, is the only surviving descendant of the ancient Doric language spoken by the Spartans. Modern Sparta was refounded in 1834 by a decree of King Otto of Greece. The rise of Philip II of Macedon and his son Alexander the Great in the late 4th century BCE significantly altered the balance of power in Greece. Athens resisted Macedonian control, but eventually succumbed to it. After Alexander's death, Athens briefly regained some autonomy, but it was eventually incorporated into the Hellenistic Seleucid Empire. Athens came under Roman influence in the 2nd century BCE, when the Romans defeated the Macedonians. While the city continued to be a center of learning and culture during the Roman period, it had lost its political independence. The focus of the Roman Empire shifted to other regions, and Athens became more of a center for philosophy and education. But with the spread of Christianity and the establishment of the Byzantine Empire, Athens' traditional religious and philosophical practices declined, and the city's importance as an intellectual center waned. But fortunately for them, Athens never suffered a complete collapse as Sparta did, and remains to this day the country's capital. Thanks very much to the books The Histories by Herodotus, The Rise of Athens by Anthony Everett, Athens by Bruce Clark, Spartans by Paul Cartledge, Thebes, also by Paul Cartledge, The Peloponnesian War by Nigel Bagnall, Bisexuality in the Ancient World by Eva Cantarella, and Europe Before Rome by T. Douglas Price. Also, thanks go to the countless websites I browsed through in search of info for this episode. And that's it for today's episode of ADHD History. Honestly, there is so much more I have to talk about regarding ancient Greece, and I'll have to do another episode about it. But I hope you enjoyed listening, and I hope to have you listen in again in 2 weeks. Next episode will probably be about the Borgia family. More like possibly. You can find me on my Facebook page, ADHD History, and on Twitter and Instagram at It's ADHD History. See you next time. Addio!